I was standing in my driveway in Phoenix, Arizona, trying to get a good signal on my phone when I saw the white Lexus pull up to my curb like some kind of patrol vehicle. The woman who stepped out wore oversized sunglasses and had that particular haircut that screamed she wanted to speak to a manager. I knew exactly who she was because I had seen her at the HOA meeting last month, sitting at the head table with a stack of papers and a permanent scowl. Her name was Patricia Henderson, and she was the president of the Desert Palms Homeowners Association. "Excuse me," she called out, marching toward me with a clipboard clutched to her chest. "Are you Quinn Garrison?" I set down the toolbox I had been carrying and wiped my hands on my jeans. "That's me. What can I do for you?" Patricia stopped about 5 feet away and adjusted her sunglasses, pushing them up into her perfectly styled blonde hair. She looked to be in her early 50s, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "I'm Patricia Henderson, president of the Desert Palms HOA. I'm here to discuss a very serious violation." "A violation?" I glanced around my property, trying to figure out what could possibly be wrong. I had just moved in 3 months ago, and I had been careful to read through the entire HOA covenant. My grass was green, my mailbox was the approved shade of black, and I had even made sure my trash cans were hidden behind the house. She pointed toward my roof with one manicured finger. "That satellite dish. It needs to come down immediately." I followed her gaze to the small dish I had installed the previous weekend. It was mounted on the back slope of my roof, barely visible from the street. "What's wrong with it?" Patricia's face turned a shade of red that clashed with her pantsuit. "What's wrong with it? It's against our community guidelines. Section 7.3 clearly states that no external antennas or satellite dishes are permitted without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee." "I wasn't aware I needed approval," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. The truth was, I had done my research before installing the dish. I had spent hours reading about the FCC rules regarding satellite dishes and antennas, but I wanted to hear what Patricia had to say first. "Ignorance is not an excuse, Mr. Garrison." She flipped through the papers on her clipboard. "I'm giving you 72 hours to remove the dish. If it's not gone by then, you'll be fined $50 per day until it's removed." "That seems a bit excessive," I said. "Those are the rules," Patricia snapped. "We have standards in this community. We can't have everyone putting up whatever they want on their homes. It creates visual clutter and brings down property values." I looked at the dish again. It was maybe 2 feet in diameter, gray to match the roof tiles, and positioned where it couldn't be seen from the front of the house. "It's barely visible. You can't even see it from the street." "I can see it from my house," Patricia said, gesturing vaguely toward the cul-de-sac. "And that's enough. The rules apply to everyone equally." "What if I told you that federal law actually protects my right to have this dish?" I asked. Patricia's eyes narrowed behind her sunglasses. "Federal law? What are you talking about?" "The FCC has something called the Over-the-Air Reception Devices Rule. It prohibits restrictions on homeowners installing antennas and satellite dishes used for receiving video programming. The rule applies even if there are HOA covenants saying otherwise." For a moment, Patricia just stared at me. Then she let out a sharp laugh. "That's ridiculous. I've been in HOA management for 15 years and I've never heard of such a thing. You can't just make up laws to get out of following the rules." "I'm not making it up," I said. "It's been in effect since 1996. I can send you the documentation if you'd like." Patricia's face went from red to purple. "Mr. Garrison, I don't appreciate being lectured about the law by someone who has been in this community for less than 6 months. You will remove that dish, or you will face the consequences." This is your only warning." She turned on her heel and marched back to her Lexus, her heels clicking against the pavement. I watched her drive away, wondering if this was really going to turn into a full-blown conflict over a satellite dish. I had moved to Phoenix for a fresh start after my divorce, taking a job as an IT consultant for a software company downtown. The last thing I wanted was drama with the HOA, but I also wasn't about to let someone bully me into removing something I had every legal right to have. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, pulling up all the documentation I had saved about the FCC rule. The Over-the-Air Reception Devices Rule, officially known as 47 CFR. Section 1.4000 was clear. It stated that viewers had the right to receive signals from direct broadcast satellites and certain other sources without restrictions imposed by local governments, property owners, or community associations. There were exceptions, but they were narrow and specific. The dish had to be less than 1 meter in diameter, which mine was. It had to be located on property that I owned or leased and where I had exclusive use, which it was. And any restrictions had to be clearly necessary for safety or historic preservation, which a general aesthetic preference was not. I drafted an email to Patricia, attaching copies of the FCC rule and several legal summaries I had found. I kept my tone polite but firm, explaining that while I respected the HOA's desire to maintain community standards, federal law specifically protected my right to install the dish. I clicked send and leaned back in my chair, hoping that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. 3 days later, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. It was from the Desert Palms HOA, formally notifying me that I was in violation of Section 7.3 of the Community Covenants and would be subject to daily fines of $50 starting immediately. There was no mention of the FCC rule, no acknowledgement of the email I had sent. Just a demand that I remove the dish within 5 business days or face legal action. I called the HOA office, but the receptionist told me that Patricia was unavailable and that I would need to submit any questions in writing. I hung up, frustrated, and decided to do more research. I found a lawyer in Scottsdale who specialized in HOA disputes and made an appointment for the following week. His name was David Chen, and his office was in a modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Camelback Mountain. He was in his mid-40s with graying hair and a firm handshake. "I've dealt with Patricia Henderson before," he said after I explained the situation. "She can be very stubborn when she thinks she's right." "So what are my options?" I asked. David leaned back in his chair. "Well, the good news is that you're absolutely correct about the FCC rule. It's been upheld in court multiple times, and it specifically prohibits HOAs from enforcing restrictions on satellite dishes in most situations. The bad news is that Patricia probably won't back down without a fight." "Can they actually fine me?" "They can try," David said. "But those fines wouldn't hold up in court. If they pursue this, you have a strong case for not only getting the fines dismissed but potentially recovering your legal fees and damages." "I don't want it to get that far," I said. "I just want to watch my shows in peace." David smiled. "I get it. Let me draft a letter to the HOA. Sometimes all it takes is a strongly worded legal notice to make them reconsider." Over the next week, David sent a detailed letter to the HOA, citing the FCC rule and warning them that any enforcement action would be met with legal resistance. I thought that would finally settle things, but Patricia had other ideas. She showed up at my door on a Saturday morning, this time with 2 other people in tow. One was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who she introduced as Leonard Mathers, the HOA treasurer. The other was a younger woman, maybe in her 30s, who carried a professional-looking camera. Patricia didn't introduce her. "Mr. Garrison," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I wanted to give you one more opportunity to resolve this matter amicably." "I thought my lawyer's letter was pretty clear," I said. "Your lawyer is misinformed," Patricia said. "We've consulted with our own legal counsel, and they've assured us that our covenants are enforceable." "Did your legal counsel read the FCC rule?" I asked. Patricia ignored the question. "We're here to document the violation for our records. I'm sure you won't mind." The woman with the camera started taking photos of my house from various angles. I stepped out onto the front porch. "You can take pictures from the street, but I'd prefer you didn't come onto my property without permission." Leonard pushed his glasses up his nose. "The HOA has the right to inspect properties for violations." "Not without reasonable notice," I said, "and not for something that isn't actually a violation." Patricia's pleasant facade cracked. "Mr. Garrison, you're being unreasonable. We're trying to maintain property values for everyone in this community. Your stubbornness is selfish." "My stubbornness?" I felt my patience wearing thin. "I'm following federal law. You're the one trying to enforce an illegal restriction." "We'll see what a judge has to say about that," Patricia said. "You're now being fined $50 per day as of 3 days ago. That's already $150 you owe the association." "I'm not paying those fines," I said flatly. Patricia's smile was cold. "Then we'll place a lien on your property. Enjoy your satellite dish while you can, Mr. Garrison. This isn't over." They left, and I immediately called David Chen. He assured me that the HOA couldn't legally enforce the fines, but he also warned me that Patricia seemed determined to make this as difficult as possible. "She's banking on you giving up rather than fighting," David said. "That's how HOAs like this operate. They wear people down." "I'm not giving up," I said. "Good," David replied. "Because I think we need to file a preemptive lawsuit. We'll ask the court for a declaratory judgment confirming your right to have the dish, and an injunction preventing the HOA from fining you or taking any action against you." "Will that be expensive?" I asked. "I'll work on a contingency basis," David said. "If we win, the HOA will have to pay your legal fees. It's part of the FCC rule. They're liable for costs when they try to enforce invalid restrictions." The next few weeks were a blur of legal filings and correspondence. David filed the lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court, and the HOA responded with a motion to dismiss. They argued that the case should be handled through arbitration, as specified in the HOA covenants. David countered that federal law superseded the covenant requirements, and that the court had jurisdiction. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Sandra Reeves, scheduled a hearing for mid-January. In the meantime, the HOA continued to send me bills for the daily fines, which had now climbed to over $1,000. I filed each bill in a folder and tried not to let it stress me out. At work, my colleagues noticed I was distracted. My friend Marcus, who worked in the same department, asked me about it over lunch one day. "You seem tense, man. Everything okay?" I told him about the situation with the HOA. He shook his head in disbelief. "That's insane. Can they really fine you for that?" "They're trying to," I said. "But the law is on my side." "I don't know how you deal with it," Marcus said. "I'd have lost my mind by now." "Trust me, I'm close," I admitted. The hearing in January was held in a modern courtroom in downtown Phoenix. David and I arrived early, and I was surprised to see how many people were in the gallery. Apparently, word had gotten around about the case, and several other homeowners from various communities had shown up to watch. Patricia arrived with Leonard and their lawyer, a stern-looking man named Richard Blackwell. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my car payment. Judge Reeves entered, and we all stood. She was in her 60s, with short gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Be seated," she said, settling into her chair. "I've reviewed the filings in this case, and I have to say, this seems like something that should have been resolved without litigation." Richard stood. "Your Honor, if I may, the HOA has every right to enforce its covenants. Mr. Garrison agreed to those covenants when he purchased his home. He can't simply ignore them because he finds them inconvenient." David stood as well. "Your Honor, this isn't about convenience. It's about federal law. The FCC's over-the-air reception devices rule explicitly prohibits restrictions like the one the HOA is trying to enforce. This rule has been in effect for nearly 30 years and has been consistently upheld." Judge Reeves looked at Richard. "Have you reviewed the FCC rule, Mr. Blackwell?" "We have, Your Honor," Richard said. "But we believe that our covenants contain sufficient safety and aesthetic justifications that fall within the exceptions to the rule." "What safety concerns does a properly installed satellite dish pose?" Judge Reeves asked. Richard hesitated. "Well, Your Honor, there's the potential for damage during high winds, which could create hazards for neighboring properties. The dish is securely mounted according to manufacturer specifications," David interjected. "There's no greater risk than any other roof-mounted fixture." Judge Reeves turned to Patricia, who was sitting at the defendant's table. "Miss Henderson, can you explain to me why this dish is such a problem? According to the photos in the record, it's barely visible from the street." Patricia stood, smoothing her skirt. "Your Honor, it's about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of our community. If we allow one person to install a satellite dish, others will want to do the same. Before long, we'll have dishes and antennas everywhere. It will look like a shanty town." Several people in the gallery gasped at her choice of words. Judge Reeves raised an eyebrow. "Miss Henderson, the FCC rule protects exactly this type of installation. Do you have any actual evidence that Mr. Garrison's dish has harmed property values or created any legitimate problems?" "We haven't conducted a formal study," Patricia admitted, "but common sense tells us that visible equipment like this is undesirable." "Common sense doesn't override federal law," Judge Reeves said. She flipped through some papers on her bench. "I'm prepared to rule on this matter today." "Mr. Blackwell, does the HOA have any other arguments?" Richard stood again. "Your Honor, we would argue that the dish could have been installed in a less visible location. The FCC rule requires homeowners to place dishes where they receive an acceptable signal, but it doesn't give them unlimited discretion." "Where would you suggest Mr. Garrison place the dish?" Judge Reeves asked. "Perhaps in his backyard, on a pole mount rather than on the roof," Richard said. David immediately responded. "Your Honor, the backyard location was tested and doesn't provide adequate signal strength due to tree coverage. The current location on the roof is the only practical option that meets signal requirements." "Do you have documentation of that?" Judge Reeves asked. "Yes, Your Honor." David handed a stack of papers to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. "These are signal strength reports from the satellite provider, showing that the current location is optimal and that alternative locations don't meet minimum signal requirements." Judge Reeves reviewed the documents for several minutes while the courtroom remained silent. Finally, she looked up. "I'm going to rule in favor of Mr. Garrison. The FCC's over-the-air reception devices rule is clear and applicable to this situation. The HOA's restrictions as applied to Mr. Garrison's satellite dish are invalid and unenforceable." Patricia stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. We have rules for a reason." "Miss Henderson, please sit down," Judge Reeves said firmly. "I'm not finished. Not only is Mr. Garrison entitled to keep his satellite dish, but the HOA is ordered to cease all collection efforts for the fines that have been assessed. Additionally, the HOA will be responsible for Mr. Garrison's attorney fees and court costs." "Your Honor, that's not fair," Patricia protested. "Miss Henderson, I suggest you consult with your attorney before saying anything else," Judge Reeves warned. "The law specifically provides for fee recovery in cases like this." The HOA attempted to enforce an invalid restriction despite being informed of the federal rule. That's exactly the kind of conduct the fee provision is meant to deter. Richard put a hand on Patricia's arm, and she reluctantly sat down. Her face was bright red, and I could see her hands trembling with anger. Judge Reeves continued, "I'm also issuing a permanent injunction prohibiting the HOA from taking any action against Mr. Garrison regarding the satellite dish. This matter is closed. If the HOA attempts to fine Mr. Garrison or otherwise retaliate against him for this lawsuit, they will be in contempt of court." She banged her gavel, and it was over. David and I stood as the judge left the courtroom. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It had been 3 months since Patricia first showed up at my house, and the stress had been eating at me. "Congratulations," David said, shaking my hand. "That was about as decisive a victory as you could hope for." "Thank you," I said. "I couldn't have done this without you." Richard approached us, his expression neutral. "We'll need to work out the details of the fee award. I assume you'll be submitting a detailed billing statement." "Within 30 days, David confirmed. As we walked out of the courtroom, several of the people from the gallery approached me. One man, who introduced himself as Robert, said he lived in a different HOA in Scottsdale and was dealing with a similar situation. "This gives me hope," he said. "I was about to give up and just take the dish down." "Don't give up," I told him. "The law is on your side." Over the next few days, I received calls from local news stations wanting to interview me about the case. I declined most of them, but I did agree to speak with a reporter from the Arizona Republic. The article ran the following week, with the headline "Phoenix Man Wins HOA Battle Over Satellite Dish." It detailed the case and included comments from legal experts about the FCC rule and HOA overreach. I thought that would be the end of my dealings with Patricia Henderson and the Desert Palms HOA. I was wrong. About 2 weeks after the court ruling, I came home from work to find a notice on my door. It was from the HOA, informing me that my property had been inspected and found to have violations of the landscaping requirements. According to the notice, my grass was 1/4 inch too tall, my shrubs needed trimming, and there were weeds in my flower beds. The total fines amounted to $300. I walked around my yard, examining everything. The grass had been mowed 3 days earlier and looked perfectly fine. The shrubs were neatly trimmed, and while there might have been a few small weeds in the flower beds, nothing that warranted a $300 fine. I called David Chen. "I think Patricia is retaliating against me." "That wouldn't surprise me," David said. "Send me photos of your property and a copy of the violation notice. If this is retaliation, we can go back to court." I spent the evening documenting everything, taking dozens of photos from every angle. The next day, I sent everything to David. He called me back within an hour. "This is absolutely retaliation. Your property looks fine. I'm going to file a motion for contempt." Judge Reeves specifically warned them not to retaliate. The motion was filed the following week, and the court scheduled an emergency hearing. This time, Judge Reeves was not in a patient mood. "Miss Henderson," she said, staring down at Patricia from the bench. "Did you understand my order from last month?" "Yes, Your Honor," Patricia said stiffly. Then can you explain to me why, less than 2 weeks after I issued a permanent injunction and warned against retaliation, you're now fining Mr. Garrison for supposed landscaping violations that appear to be completely fabricated? They're not fabricated, Your Honor, Patricia insisted. We conducted a routine inspection and found legitimate violations. A routine inspection. Judge Reeves picked up a document. According to the records provided by Mr. Garrison's attorney, no other properties in the community were inspected that week. In fact, there haven't been any other landscaping violation notices issued in the past 6 months, so this inspection was specifically targeted at Mr. Garrison. Richard stood. Your Honor, Ms. Henderson has the discretion to inspect properties as she sees fit. The fact that Mr. Garrison's property was inspected shortly after the previous ruling is merely coincidental. I don't believe in coincidences, Mr. Blackwell, Judge Reeves said. I've reviewed the photos submitted by both parties. Mr. Garrison's property appears to be in excellent condition, certainly not deserving of $300 in fines. This is textbook retaliation, and I won't tolerate it. She turned to Patricia. Miss Henderson, I'm finding you and the HOA in contempt of court. The fines against Mr. Garrison are dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot be reassessed. Additionally, the HOA will pay Mr. Garrison an additional $5,000 in damages for this retaliatory action. Patricia's mouth fell open. Your Honor, I can't possibly. The HOA will pay, Judge Reeves interrupted. Not you personally, unless the board decides to pursue recovery against you for acting outside the scope of your authority, but that's between you and the board. This is ridiculous, Patricia said, her voice rising. I was just doing my job. Your job is not to harass homeowners who have prevailed against the HOA in court, Judge Reeves said sharply. Your job is to manage the association fairly and within the bounds of the law. You failed to do that. If there are any further violations of my order, I will consider more severe sanctions, including the possibility of removing you from your position as HOA president through judicial order. After the hearing, I stood outside the courthouse with David. I can't believe she did that, I said. After everything that happened, she still came after me. Some people can't accept being wrong, David said. Patricia has probably been running that HOA with an iron fist for years. The idea that someone successfully challenged her authority was too much for her ego to handle. What happens now? I asked. Now you go home and enjoy your satellite dish in peace, David said with a smile. The HOA has to pay you $8,000 total, including the original attorney fees and the contempt damages. That check should arrive within 30 days. I shook his hand. Thanks for everything, David. I mean it. Anytime, he said. And if Patricia gives you any more trouble, you call me immediately. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. The whole ordeal had been exhausting, but I had stood up for my rights and won. When I pulled into my driveway, I looked up at the satellite dish on my roof. It seemed almost symbolic now, a little gray dish that represented something much bigger than just watching television. That evening, I was watching a movie when my doorbell rang. I paused the TV and went to answer it, half expecting to find Patricia on my doorstep with some new complaint. Instead, it was my neighbor from 2 houses down, a friendly guy named Tom who I had talked to a few times at community events. Hey, Quinn, he said. I hope I'm not bothering you. Not at all, I said. What's up? I heard about what happened with the HOA and your satellite dish, Tom said. I wanted to thank you. Thank me. For what? For fighting back, Tom said. Patricia and the HOA board have been running roughshod over this community for years. They fine people for the smallest things. They make arbitrary decisions about what improvements we can make to our homes, and if you question them, they come down even harder. A lot of us have been too scared to push back because we don't want the hassle. But you showed that they can be challenged and beaten. I just wanted to watch my shows, I said with a laugh. Maybe, Tom said, but you did something important. Since your case made the news, I've heard from at least 6 other people in the neighborhood who are talking about running for the HOA board in the next election. We might actually get some reasonable people in charge for a change. After Tom left, I thought about what he had said. I hadn't set out to start some kind of revolution in the HOA. I just wanted to exercise my legal rights. But maybe that was enough. Maybe standing up to unreasonable authority, even over something as small as a satellite dish, could inspire others to do the same. The check from the HOA arrived 3 weeks later, exactly as Judge Reeves had ordered. $8,000. I deposited it and used some of the money to take a weekend trip to Sedona, something I had been wanting to do since moving to Arizona. It felt good to celebrate the victory properly. When I got back from Sedona, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was from the Desert Palms HOA, but the tone was completely different from previous communications. It informed me that Patricia Henderson had resigned as HOA president, effective immediately. The letter was signed by Leonard Mathers, who had been appointed interim president until the next election. I wasn't surprised. The contempt ruling had been embarrassing for Patricia, and the financial penalties had probably made her position untenable with the board. I felt a small pang of sympathy for her, but it was hard to feel too bad for someone who had brought it all on herself through stubbornness and refusal to follow the law. A week later, Leonard knocked on my door. I answered, curious about what he wanted. "Mr. Garrison," he said, extending his hand. "I wanted to apologize on behalf of the HOA board for everything that happened. Patricia acted without the full board's knowledge or approval on many of the actions she took regarding your satellite dish." "I appreciate that," I said, shaking his hand. "We've retained new legal counsel who has advised us to review all of our covenants and make sure they comply with federal and state law," Leonard continued. "We don't want a repeat of this situation." "That sounds like a good idea," I said. "We're also going to be more transparent about our decision-making process," Leonard said. "And we're working on creating a formal appeals process for residents who feel they've been unfairly fined or sanctioned." "That would have been helpful 3 months ago," I said, but I kept my tone light. Leonard smiled ruefully. "Yes, it would have. Again, I'm sorry for everything you went through. You were right and we were wrong." After he left, I felt a sense of closure. The whole situation had been frustrating and stressful, but it had ended as well as I could have hoped. I had my satellite dish. I had been vindicated in court, and the HOA was making changes to prevent future problems. Over the following months, life in Desert Palms gradually returned to normal. The HOA held elections in May, and several new board members were elected, including Tom from down the street. Leonard chose not to run, saying he had only taken the position temporarily to help stabilize things after Patricia's departure. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Patricia had moved to Tucson shortly after resigning. Some people said she had family there. Others said she just wanted a fresh start away from the embarrassment of the court cases. Either way, I never saw her again. One evening in June, I was sitting on my back patio, enjoying the warm desert air when Marcus called. We had become better friends since I had told him about the HOA situation, and we had started getting together for basketball on weekends. "Turn on the news," Marcus said when I answered. "Channel 12. "Why? What's going on?" "Just turn it on, you'll see." I went inside and switched on the TV. A reporter was standing in front of a suburban home, and the headline at the bottom of the screen read, "HOA President Arrested for Embezzlement." The president of the Suncrest HOA in Glendale was arrested today on charges of embezzling more than $50,000 from the association's reserve fund, the reporter was saying. Residents first became suspicious when they requested financial records and found numerous irregularities. The camera cut to footage of a woman being led out of a house in handcuffs. I leaned forward, studying her face. She looked familiar, but it wasn't anyone I knew personally. Authorities say this case highlights a growing problem with HOA accountability in Arizona, the reporter continued. State lawmakers are now considering legislation that would require more oversight and financial transparency for homeowners associations. Marcus called back. "Can you believe that? Makes your thing with Patricia seem almost tame." "At least Patricia never stole from the association," I said. "As far as we know." "True," Marcus said, "but it makes you wonder how many HOA board members are abusing their power in different ways. You were smart to fight back." After hanging up with Marcus, I thought about how different things might have been if I had just removed the satellite dish when Patricia first demanded it. I would have saved myself months of stress and legal battles. But I also would have let her get away with enforcing an illegal restriction. And who knows how many other homeowners she would have gone after for equally baseless violations. Sometimes doing the right thing is hard. Sometimes it's expensive and time-consuming and frustrating. But it's still worth doing. The summer passed quietly. I focused on my work, spent time with friends, and explored more of Arizona. I hiked Camelback Mountain, visited the Grand Canyon, and took a weekend trip to Lake Powell. Life was good. In August, I received an unexpected call from a woman who introduced herself as Jennifer Morrison. She explained that she was a producer for a local radio show that focused on consumer rights and legal issues. They wanted to interview me about my experience with the HOA and the FCC rule. "I'm not really looking for publicity," I told her. "I understand," Jennifer said, "but we've been getting a lot of calls from listeners who are dealing with similar HOA issues. Your case is a perfect example of how homeowners can stand up for their rights. Even if you just talk for 15 or 20 minutes, it could help a lot of people." I thought about Tom and the other neighbors who had thanked me for fighting back. If sharing my story could help others, maybe it was worth doing. "Okay," I said. "When do you want to do the interview?" The interview aired the following week. It was a pleasant conversation with the host, who asked thoughtful questions about the legal process and what I had learned. I emphasized that homeowners should know their rights and not be afraid to challenge HOA restrictions that conflict with federal or state law. After the show aired, I got several emails from listeners thanking me for speaking out. One man wrote that he had been about to take down his satellite dish after his HOA threatened him with fines, but after hearing my interview, he decided to fight back. Another woman said she was dealing with an HOA that wouldn't let her install solar panels, and my story had inspired her to research the Federal Solar Rights Act. It felt good to know that my experience had helped others. That was worth all the stress and frustration. In September, the Desert Palms HOA held its annual meeting. I attended, curious to see how things had changed under the new board. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the entrance to the neighborhood. Tom, who was now serving as treasurer, gave a financial report that was surprisingly detailed and transparent. He explained where the association's money was going, how much was in reserve, and what projects were planned for the coming year. It was a stark contrast to the previous meetings I had attended, where Patricia had rushed through the agenda and dismissed questions from residents. After the meeting, Several people came up to talk to me. An older woman named Margaret thanked me again for taking on the HOA. "You gave a lot of us courage," she said. "I've lived in this community for 10 years, and this is the first time I've felt like the board actually represents the homeowners rather than just telling us what to do." A younger couple introduced themselves as the Hendersons and mentioned they had just moved in. "We heard about what happened with the previous HOA president," the husband said. "It actually made us more confident about buying here, knowing that the community was working to improve things." Driving home that night, I reflected on how much had changed in less than a year. When I had first moved to Desert Palms, I had been focused on starting fresh and avoiding drama. Instead, I had ended up in the middle of a legal battle that became a minor news story and helped spark changes in the community. Life is funny that way. You never know when standing up for something small will turn into something bigger. The following month, I got a call from David Chen. "I thought you might want to know," he said. "Remember Richard Blackwell, the HOA's attorney?" "Hard to forget him," I said. "He's being investigated by the state bar for ethics violations," David said. "Apparently, he's been advising multiple HOAs to enforce restrictions that violate federal law, even after being informed of the relevant regulations. Your case was just one of many." "Will he lose his license?" I asked. "Hard to say," David said. "But at minimum, he'll probably face some kind of disciplinary action. The bar takes this stuff seriously, especially when it involves repeatedly giving clients bad legal advice." "Patricia picked a real winner as her lawyer," I said. "They deserved each other," David replied with a laugh. In November, I was contacted by a law student at Arizona State University who was writing a paper about the FCC's over the air reception devices rule. She wanted to interview me about my case as part of her research. We met at a coffee shop in Tempe, and I spent an hour answering her questions about the legal process, the challenges I had faced, and the outcome. "It's interesting how often HOAs try to enforce these restrictions even though the law is so clear," she said. "Why do you think that is?" I considered the question. I think it's partly ignorance. A lot of HOA board members are volunteers who don't have legal training. They assume that if something is in the covenants, it's automatically enforceable. But I also think it's partly arrogance. People like Patricia get used to having power, and they don't like being told they're wrong. "Do you think the legal system does enough to protect homeowners?" she asked. "In my case, it worked," I said. "But I had the resources to hire a good lawyer and the time to see the case through. A lot of people don't have those advantages. The system needs to be more accessible." She thanked me for my time, and as she left, I thought about our conversation. The legal system had worked for me, but how many people had backed down when faced with similar situations simply because they couldn't afford to fight? December brought cooler weather and the holiday season. I flew back to Ohio to spend Christmas with my family. My mom asked about the HOA situation, having heard bits and pieces from me over the phone during the whole ordeal. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself," she said. "Your father would have been proud too." My dad had passed away 2 years earlier, one of the reasons I had decided to make a fresh start in Arizona. He had been a quiet man, but principled. I like to think he would have approved of how I had handled things. When I returned to Phoenix in early January, I found my neighborhood covered in white lights and decorations left over from the holidays. It looked festive and welcoming, a far cry from the tense atmosphere that had dominated during the conflict with Patricia. I settled back into my routine, working during the week and exploring Arizona on weekends. The satellite dish on my roof continued to work perfectly, providing me with all the channels I wanted. Every time I looked at it, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. In February, I received an invitation to speak at a local homeowners' rights workshop being organized by a nonprofit organization. The workshop was aimed at educating people about their rights when dealing with HOAs and providing resources for those in disputes. I agreed to participate, figuring it was another opportunity to help others avoid the problems I had faced. The workshop was held on a Saturday morning at a community college in Mesa. About 50 people attended, ranging from young couples to retirees. I told my story, emphasizing the importance of knowing your rights and not being intimidated by threats from HOAs. The audience asked thoughtful questions, and several people approached me afterward to share their own experiences. One man told me about an HOA that had fined him for parking his work truck in his driveway, even though he needed it for his business. Another woman described a lengthy battle over the color she wanted to paint her front door. Their stories reminded me that my experience wasn't unique. HOAs across the country were overstepping their authority, and homeowners needed to be empowered to fight back. As winter turned to spring, life continued peacefully in Desert Palms. The new HOA board was doing a good job, focusing on actual community needs rather than petty enforcement of aesthetic rules. The common areas were well maintained, community events were better organized, and there were fewer complaints about arbitrary fines. In March, I learned that Patricia Henderson's name had come up in connection with another legal matter. According to Tom, who still kept tabs on neighborhood gossip, Patricia was being sued by her former HOA in Tucson for attempting to implement similarly aggressive enforcement policies. Apparently, old habits died hard. Some people never learn, Tom said when he told me about it. She's doing the same thing there that she did here. Maybe she'll get another education in federal law, I said. By April, exactly 1 year after the court ruling in my favor, I decided to host a small barbecue in my backyard. I invited several neighbors, including Tom and his family, Marcus from work, and a few other people I had gotten to know. It was a warm spring evening, perfect for grilling burgers and sitting outside. As we ate and talked, Tom raised his beer. I want to propose a toast to Quinn, who showed us that you don't have to put up with bullies, even when they're running your HOA. Everyone clinked their bottles and glasses together. I felt a little embarrassed by the attention, but also grateful. These people had become friends, and the community had become a real home. I just wanted to watch my satellite TV, I said with a laugh, but I appreciate the support. You did more than that, Marcus said. You changed this whole neighborhood. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized he was right. What had started as a simple dispute over a satellite dish had turned into something much bigger. It had exposed problems with the HOA's leadership, led to meaningful reforms, and inspired other homeowners to stand up for their rights. Sometimes the smallest battles lead to the biggest changes. As the evening wound down and my guests began to leave, I stood in my backyard looking up at the stars. The satellite dish on my roof was barely visible in the darkness, just a small silhouette against the night sky. It was such a minor thing, really. A piece of equipment that let me watch television shows and movies. But it had also been a symbol of something important, the right to make decisions about my own property without unreasonable interference. That right was worth fighting for, even when the fight was difficult and stressful. I thought about Patricia and wondered if she had learned anything from what happened. Probably not, based on the reports from Tucson. Some people are so invested in being right that they can never admit when they're wrong, but that was her problem, not mine. The HOA had paid the damages and attorney fees as ordered by the court. The satellite dish remained on my roof, working perfectly. And life in Desert Palms had improved significantly under new leadership. By any measure, the outcome had been positive. In May, I received an email from the law student I had spoken with in November. Her paper had been published in the Arizona State University Law Review, and she wanted to send me a copy. I read it with interest, pleased to see that my case had been used as an example of how federal law can protect homeowners from overreaching HOAs. The paper concluded with a recommendation that Arizona adopt stronger protections for homeowners and more oversight for HOAs. It was a well-reasoned argument, and I hoped that lawmakers would take notice. Summer arrived, bringing with it temperatures well over 100 degrees. I spent most of my free time indoors, enjoying the air conditioning and watching shows on the television connected to my satellite dish. The dish continued to work flawlessly, never giving me any technical problems. I occasionally saw Leonard Mathers around the neighborhood. We were cordial to each other, exchanging pleasantries, but never discussing the past conflict. He seemed relieved to no longer be involved with the HOA board, having served his brief term as interim president before stepping down. In July, I got a call from David Chen. "I thought you'd want to know," he said. "Richard Blackwell received a formal reprimand from the state bar. He's also agreed to take continuing education courses on federal regulations affecting HOAs. So he's still practicing?" I asked. "For now," David said, "but his reputation has taken a hit. A lot of HOAs are dropping him as counsel. Word gets around in the legal community." "Good," I said. "Maybe he'll think twice before giving bad advice in the future." "One can hope," David replied. As summer turned to fall, I reflected on the year and a half since I had moved to Phoenix. It had been eventful, to say the least. The conflict with the HOA had been stressful and time-consuming, but it had also been educational. I had learned about federal law, the court system, and the importance of standing up for your rights. More importantly, I had learned about community. The support I received from neighbors like Tom, the friendships I developed with people like Marcus, and the sense of satisfaction that came from helping others by sharing my experience. All of these things had enriched my life in unexpected ways. In October, the Desert Palms HOA held another annual meeting. The atmosphere was completely different from the previous year. The new board presented detailed reports, took questions from residents, and discussed plans for community improvements. There was a sense of cooperation and mutual respect that had been missing under Patricia's leadership. After the meeting, I was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Sarah. "I just bought a house here last month," she said. "I heard about what you did with the satellite dish. I think it's great that you stood up to the HOA." "Thanks," I said. "How are you liking the neighborhood?" "It's wonderful," Sarah said. "Everyone has been so welcoming, and I feel good knowing that the HOA is reasonable and follows the law." Her comment struck me. The reputation of the community had improved because of the changes that followed the lawsuit. That was worth something. November brought cooler weather and a sense of contentment. I had been in my house for almost 2 years, and it finally felt like home. The yard was established, the interior was decorated to my taste, and I knew my neighbors. Life was good. I thought occasionally about Patricia and wondered where she was and what she was doing. The last I had heard, the lawsuit in Tucson was ongoing. Part of me hoped she would eventually learn from her mistakes, but I wasn't optimistic. Some people are too stubborn to change. As for me, I had moved on. The satellite dish remained on my roof, a quiet reminder of the battle I had won and the principle I had defended. Every time I watched a show or a movie, I felt a small sense of satisfaction knowing that I had stood up for my rights and prevailed. December arrived, and with it came the holiday season again. I decorated my house with lights and a small Christmas tree, following the HOA's reasonable guidelines for holiday decorations. The guidelines had been updated by the new board to be less restrictive and more focused on safety, rather than rigid aesthetic control. On Christmas Eve, I sat in my living room watching a classic holiday movie on the television connected to my satellite dish. The house was warm and comfortable, and I felt at peace. The past year and a half had been challenging, but I had come through it stronger and more confident. The satellite dish had been worth fighting for, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. The right to make decisions about my own property. The right to challenge authority when it overstepped its bounds. The right to expect that laws would be followed and that justice would prevail. Those rights are fundamental, and they're worth defending, even when the fight is difficult, even when it's just about a satellite dish. As I watched the movie, I thought about all the people who had supported me through the conflict. David Chen, who had provided expert legal counsel and fought for my rights in court. Tom and my other neighbors, who had encouraged me to stand firm and later used my case as inspiration to reform the HOA. Marcus, who had listened to my frustrations and offered friendship when I needed it. I also thought about Judge Reeves, who had quickly cut through the nonsense and applied the law as it was written. Her decisive rulings had not only resolved my case, but had also sent a clear message to Patricia and the HOA that they couldn't bully homeowners into giving up their legal rights. The movie ended, and I switched off the TV. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, with houses lit up in holiday decorations. It looked like a community where people actually wanted to live, not a place ruled by petty tyrants enforcing arbitrary rules. That was the real victory, I realized. Not just that I got to keep my satellite dish, but that the community had been improved as a result of standing up to unreasonable authority. The new HOA board was focused on serving homeowners rather than controlling them. The covenants had been reviewed and updated to comply with federal law. And residents felt empowered to question decisions rather than simply accepting whatever the board decreed. Change is possible, even in the face of stubborn resistance. It just requires someone willing to stand up and fight for what's right. As the year drew to a close, I felt grateful for everything that had happened, even the difficult parts. The conflict with Patricia and the HOA had been stressful, but it had also been meaningful. I had defended an important principle, helped improve my community, and inspired others to stand up for their rights. The satellite dish on my roof would probably last for many years, faithfully pulling down signals from space and delivering entertainment to my television. Every time I looked at it, I would remember the battle and the victory. I would remember that federal law protected my rights and that courts would enforce those rights when necessary. But more than that, I would remember the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Even when the fight seems disproportionate to the issue at stake. Because sometimes, fighting for a small thing is really about defending something much larger: justice, fairness, the rule of law, the right to live in your home without unreasonable interference. Those things are worth fighting for, whether the battle is over a satellite dish or something else entirely. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed on that Christmas Eve, I felt satisfied with how everything had turned out. The satellite dish remained on my roof. Patricia was gone. The HOA had been reformed. And I had learned valuable lessons about standing up for my rights and fighting back against unjust authority. It had been quite a journey, all because of one small satellite dish and one determined HOA president who didn't know when to back down. But in the end, federal law had prevailed, justice had been served, and my community was better for it. That was a pretty good outcome for a dispute that started with a simple demand to remove a satellite dish. And somewhere in space, satellites continued to orbit, beaming down signals that I had every legal right to receive. That thought made me smile as I drifted off to sleep, content with the knowledge that I had fought the good fight and won.